Hey, what's up? Some of you may not know I was a scholar of Buddhism for more than 10 years, studied the ancient canonical language, blah, 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 spent time in Buddhist temples with Buddhist monks, traveled, lectured. I delivered lectures myself at universities, and I visited and studied, both in a totally religious context, but also in these kind of semi-religious, semi-secular university context. But the vast majority of what I learned on my own, let me tell you, because the vast majority of what gets taught at those institutions is dishonest bullshit. And as you might already guess from the candor of that statement I made within the last 60 seconds, I am not a true believing Buddhist. I never believed in supernatural elements of Buddhism. I never believed in hell or heaven. I never believed that meditation can have supernatural effects or magical outcomes for you. But also today, I identify as an ex-Buddhist. I do not consider myself a Buddhist at all. So I do not believe in the religion. I do not believe in the future of the religion. However, there are still people who come to this channel because they've read some of my work from the past, my past research on Buddhism. There's still people who come to this channel hoping I'm going to record more videos talking about Buddhism as a philosophy, as a religion, maybe in connection to politics or something like this. Understandable. I was one of the few kind of sober voices. Is sober the word I want to use? Expressing concerns about a lot of what was going on in contemporary Buddhism in the past, and it's doubtful I'm going to play that role again, but it's still cool that there are people who are serious Buddhists who respect what I have to say and who send me questions asking my opinion, etc. Now, these days I'm mostly known for talking about veganism, so in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the prospects of Buddhism in the future, and naturally people watching this channel will be interested about Buddhism in connection to animal rights, ecology, veganism, but I guess just, Buddhism in terms of real-world, practicable ethics. What are the prospects? I made a comment on someone else's video lately. Another vegan made a video which was not very well informed. He hadn't done any research on Buddhism. He didn't know either historical or contemporary what the real ethical factors were. But another vegan made a video complaining about the Buddhist practice of buying animals. So, for instance, a caged bird or buying lobsters and then setting them free in ceremonies to generate good karma, and all the absurdities that go into this, including the fact that often they end up killing the animals. But anyway, and you know how absurd this was for people who are eating meat every day to be buying caged birds and setting them free, etc. There are all these obvious contradictions in it. But anyway, I gave him a reply and I said, look, I used to be a scholar of Buddhism, blah, blah, blah. I very briefly said both good and bad about what's going on in Buddhism. One of the good things I said, look, unlike other religions, Buddhism is susceptible to change. It is susceptible to improvement. To say that Buddhism has changed a lot in the last 50 years would be a great understatement. And to say it's changed a lot in the last 100 years would be even more of an understatement. Buddhism has been rapidly changing in many different directions. So almost any problem you can point to within Buddhism, for instance, the status of women, or the status of eating meat, or any of these issues, you can also point to, countercurrents and debates within Buddhism that have challenged the status quo, and you can point to examples of Buddhist traditions that have taken radically different contradictory paths in response to those questions. Should women be equal? Should people eat meat? Any possible practical ethical question, you're going to get that kind of diversity and debate ongoing. Especially in the period right after World War II, something I've made many videos about. And let's face it, if you were living anywhere in the continent of Asia after World War II, the spectacle of the atom bomb, on the one hand, and the spectacle of the rise of communism, for example, in China, these were major inspirations for the religion to reevaluate its past, present, and future. So that was a period of especially rapid change. And I do not think you can find a similar period of change in the last 100 years for Christianity, for example. Certainly, Christianity has also changed. Don't get me wrong. I know. I'm aware. Just look at the Vatican. The Vatican's taking on radical new ideas every week, I'm sure. I realize there have been some changes, but I'm saying that within Buddhism, the change has been much more profound, much more unpredictable, and is still ongoing. Okay, so let's break it down. What are we talking about if we're really looking at Buddhism now and in the future in reference to these, shall we say, thematic concerns of mine? I remember reading an interview with a Cambodian man who had converted from Buddhism to Christianity. So he had grown up with Buddhism and converted to Christianity. And one of the things he pointed out, which I thought was very insightful, is that in Buddhism, there is a concept of virtue, but not of enough virtue, not of adequate virtue. Whereas one of the things he liked about Christianity was that in Christianity, there was a very clear point at which you had done enough. You believed enough, you did enough, you were good enough, and it was certain that when you died, you'd go to heaven. And that's it. Now, I read that. I didn't meet that man. I read that. Recently, here in China, I met someone who was a member of one of the indigenous ethnic minorities. I won't give all the details, but she grew up in a culturally Buddhist setting, Theravada Buddhist, but she was a Christian. I think her mother converted to Christianity. Someone in her family, so she didn't make the decision herself. And it was fascinating to me because she made the same point. For her also, this was a big deal. She said, yeah, Buddhism, she sort of said words like Buddhism is more interesting. Like Buddhism has more philosophy, it's more nuanced, it's more complex. But in Christianity, it's simple. This is what you have to do, and then it's enough. It's enough virtue. Then you know you're saved. You got the checklist of what you have to do to get into heaven. And once you've checked all the boxes, you're done. So I think it is interesting. Buddhism, on the one hand, is known for being very morally permissive, which it is. If you go to Thailand, a lot of people think Buddhism has no restrictions on sexual behavior because a culture like Thailand today is so permissive. Buddhism kind of stares out at the world as in terms of infinite virtue and yet insufficient virtue. This is interesting. This interacts with things like ecology and animal rights and veganism in a very strange way. To refuse to kill animals is virtuous in Buddhism. So you think there's already a powerful, wonderful basis for future veganism and ecology. But on the other hand, it's sort of in this miasma where, quitting smoking is virtuous, refusing to kill animals is virtuous, nobody can be virtuous all the time, violence is inevitable, even, torture and killing and joining the army is inevitable. People should kind of sort of try their best all the time. And yet, in a country like Thailand, it seems that you're surrounded by people who are never trying their best at any time. That this sense that, individuals pursue virtue not within one human lifetime, not with one goal of getting into heaven after they die, not with one checklist for what's a sin and what's a virtue, but that they are playing this game against a millennium-long, epoch-spanning, cycle of reincarnation. That vice and virtue, that indulgences and, glorious acts, they've gone on for millions of years through all your former lifetimes and your future lifetimes. And thus the significance of, eating meat at any one meal, this seems to recede into the background as a tiny and trivial thing. It is very rare to meet devout Buddhists who give a damn about eating meat. And I've met people who quit being Buddhists for that reason, who actually changed religions because they did care about ecology and veganism. And so they switched to another religion because they got fed up with the indifference that exists within Buddhism. Now, I could also say, without getting on to it at too much length, the emphasis on intellectual virtues in Buddhism is more or less unique in world religions. And I've also seen Christians complain about that, where they say, oh, well, Buddhists, you're a bunch of snobs. You care about these intellectual virtues. You don't care so much about the loving and caring kind of mom and pop virtues. That critique has some merit to it. And it's true, the kind of peculiar intellectual snobbery within Theravada Buddhism, also true within Japanese Buddhism, many forms of Buddhism, there is kind of a sense often like, well, why would you even concern yourself with something as low as killing animals or the mud and blood of these sorts of animal ethics issues, when you can instead be directing your attention to the life of the mind, the life, these more refined, supposedly refined and elegant intellectual pursuits and concerns than Buddhism. So that is true. I think there's a sense in which the intellectual apparatus of Buddhism becomes counterproductive in reference to ethics and practical political action. Even when you're faced with something as obvious as, let's bring it back to ecology real quick. I used to live and work in Bangkok, and I had a job that was a government job, put it that way. So, you kind of went to a bunch of strange locations that are owned by the government. The government owned a prison, and they were thinking about decommissioning the prison and putting something new there. They owned this historical building, this wooden building, and they were talking about renovating it. So I kind of went to a few different construction sites as part of this job I had in Bangkok. One of the government experts mentioned to me in passing, he said, the entire city, the populated area of Bangkok, is less than 1 meter above sea level, above the ocean level. And most city, you're down to millimeters, you're down to centimeters. And on the same day that he said that to me, I was standing there on this construction site, and they had one of these giant machines that scoops the earth out of the way. And as soon as this machine put the metal into the earth, it was going down centimeters, and then there was water. So, the surface of the earth of this construction site was centimeters above semi-saline sea level. There, the water is a mixture of river water on the way out. It's a river delta, to be blunt, and of ocean water on the way in. And you stand there and look at that, and this shockingly fragile ecology. And Bangkok, periodically they flood, and the whole city is underwater. Periodically they have outbreak of disease, as you'd expect. And you think, people can ignore this ecological threat even in this setting. You know what I mean? Even when the rising water is visible, almost between your toes, Questions of adequate virtue, questions of doing enough, questions of having a hard checklist of what governments and individuals should do. With ecology, it's not about what you're doing in the next 10 incarnations. I don't really give a fuck what you did 1,000 years ago when you were born as a slave in Egypt or some shit. I don't believe in reincarnation at all, in case you can't guess. But my point is, a worldview that sees this society and this ecology as a transitory and trivial problem compared to the timescale of millions of years in which they sincerely believe that people are being reincarnated again and again, and indeed that the world itself regenerates again and again. There are multiple worlds, basically the same as this one, that arise and fall. The idea we have to tackle this problem now in the next 10 years because we're really concerned about the next 50 years or the next 150 years. Actually, even though people glorify Buddhism as somehow setting up a great foundation for ecological concern, in many ways I feel the opposite. And you see this even with something as simple as deforestation. Deforestation is in many ways a lot easier to visualize and chart out than global warming or rising ocean levels. Why did Thailand cut down all of its forest? Well, looking at it in terms of millions of years, I guess. In that greater scheme of things, elephants going extinct, tigers going extinct, the last of the forest being cut down. Whose problem is it? In Buddhism, whose problem is it? Is it the government's problem? I mean, obviously most religions do not have a modern democratic notion of government. Is it your problem? Is it my problem? Is it the problem for a bunch of vegan activists? Whose problem is it? We can't expect it to be the corporations that make millions of dollars out of cutting down the trees. We can't expect it to be timber corporations and paper corporations. So whose problem is it? It's not Buddhist monks' problem. That's damn sure. I mean, get over the last few years. And there's been so much false excitement over the few Buddhist monks who made lectures here and there talking about ecology. I know that about that. I've read about that. But this is like you can go through Catholicism and look at the few Catholic monks who supported the legal right to abortion. I mean, within every religion, once you get into millions of members of religion, a large religion, there are going to be some outliers, some exceptions to the rules. I think there are some Catholics who support, abortion as being legal, but that don't construe that as something it isn't. So I raised this most general problem to begin with. I think if we're going to talk sincerely about the future of Buddhism in connection to the future of veganism, ecology, etc., just the future of planet Earth, I think we also have to look at it in terms of mythology. And mythology is maybe the aspect of Buddhism that white Western people tend to overlook the most or tend to avoid thinking about the most. They tend to want to address Buddhism in terms of a relatively clean philosophical system, and not to deal with the grubby reality of the mythology. For example, hell. In Buddhism, if you do bad things, you die and you go to hell. And that hell is described at great length, many gory details, exactly what kind of torture you're going to get, and so on in the ancient scriptures. And that's why if you go on vacation in Thailand, you will see many gory paintings of that hell on the walls of Buddhist temples. The best thing about mythology is that it can lead you to ask questions that you otherwise wouldn't ask. It can spark interest. It can spark thematic concern. It can inspire you and shape your life in a positive way. And the worst thing about mythology is that it prevents you from asking questions. I think the example of hell itself is a very powerful example. I think that many, many people do not question the nature of good and evil, whether it's personal sin and virtue or public policy, if they believe, as part of their religious view of the world, if you do blank, you go to hell. It kind of prevents any more sophisticated sociological or political, philosophizing about, reflecting on, what the issues and options are. I don't know. We could give a million examples, like the history of homosexuality and religious-backed homophobia, or even the history of, government policy on drug use. If you start off with the view using this drug means you die and go to hell, you're not going to ask questions that lead to a more sophisticated harm reduction approach or questions of what's effective, blah, blah, blah. And, the United States of America went through the ultimate experiment in that through what's called prohibition, when they briefly made alcohol illegal. But yeah, if you believe something is evil and results in you dying and going to hell, that is probably not going to inspire you to have an open-minded, to engage in open-minded original research into really understanding the problem, politically, ethically, socially, or otherwise. Well, now what? Where does that lead us? Why is it that the role of mythology in human society and culture is so often to provide a kind of halt to the progress of free inquiry and understanding, and so rarely to raise and open up new and positive questions? In dealing sincerely with the prospects of Buddhism as a religion for the future, I think we do have to look at the mythology, and that mythology includes hell. And the mythology, in a very real sense, is not going to change. People's attitudes towards the mythology change. The philosophy can be very fast changing. Ethics in an abstract sense in terms of what gets preached or what have you. The mythology and the worldview is not going to change. And you have to understand the core mythology, the core myth of reincarnation, even though it has built into it the concept that killing an animal is a bad thing, that an animal in a former life could have been a human being, or in its next life could have been a human being. You also have to recognize this has built into it a real abdication of personal responsibility, and in a sense a real annihilation of the dignity of the particular animal, or the importance of the particular animal. To some extent, it also destroys the sense of dignity or importance of a particular human life, although less so. Partly because it holds up human life as the apex of this pseudo-evolutionary cycle of incarnation and reincarnation, that the ultimate thing that an animal can become is a human being. And by the way, even though human beings can be reincarnated as gods or angels, sometimes pronounced, but really we're talking about gods in the plural. Even the gods ultimately would like to be reincarnated as human beings, because the opportunity to achieve nirvana, the opportunity to do virtuous deeds, that lies entirely with human beings. So it makes us very much the center of the moral universe, very much the center of the intellectual universe. And also in Buddhism, the gods are not wise, a bit like ancient Greece. The gods don't really know anything that we don't know. There's a big contrast to Christianity. So, the gods, some of them are kind of buffoons, like Zeus and Hercules. They're just not particularly intelligent. They have the same intelligence of a human being or less. And is very clearly established many times that the gods know less than the Buddha knows, that they're less wise than a wise Buddhist monk or what have you. When I made this comment on this other YouTuber's video, I closed it by saying, okay, look, so I was a scholar of Buddhism for more than 10 years and know a lot about Buddhism. I can see both good and bad in it. I can see the potential for positive change. Do I have any optimism for the future? Not enough to be a Buddhist myself. That's I not only did I have the choice to be a Buddhist, I was a Buddhist. I mean, I was a member of the religion, and I quit. I became an ex-Buddhist. I've made other videos reflecting on that. I don't want to repeat what I've said in other videos. My reasons for not being a Buddhist are not the subject of this video. They're the subject of those videos I made in the past. However, I do think it is foolish in the extreme to assume that the aesthetics of Buddhism and the mythology of Buddhism is going to provide a powerful basis for veganism. The reality of what we're doing in Asia with veganism is actually competing with Buddhism. We're actually offering people an alternative that caters to some of the same ethical impulses that many modern Buddhists are seeking in Buddhism and are being disappointed with. Like there are modern Buddhists who really care about animal rights, who really care about ecology, and then they go to the temple and they hear all this horseshit that either pays insincere lip service to those themes or fails to even do that. I have seen that myself, have studied that myself, etc. I mean, the fundamental evasion of this worldly responsibility, the fundamental abdication of the sense of we do this now or never. It's got to be this life. It's got to be this generation. It's got to be this decade. To be blunt, me, now. That's the undercurrent in all ecological politics, including veganism. And that's totally antithetical to the Buddhist worldview. If there's anything that is not going to fly, a tone nobody wants to strike when giving a morality lecture as a Buddhist monk, it's me, now. They're instead constantly emphasizing selflessness, a sense of selflessness that is, I think, evasive and abdicates responsibility, and a sense of timelessness. So it's not me, it's not now, it doesn't have to be this generation, it doesn't have to be this year. That's very much built into the mythology, the worldview, the aesthetics, etc. of Buddhism, even though, certainly you can see culturally, if you compare Buddhism to Islam, Buddhism culturally is a much better preparation for veganism and ecology, both. It's much better than Islam, infinitely better. No question. There's, it's 10,000 times better. But nevertheless, when we're looking ahead, when we're looking at the next step in the 21st century, we're not looking back, we're not evaluating 500 years ago or even 50 years ago. We're saying, okay, now and moving forward, it does seem to me very obvious that in reality, vegans and ecologically concerned people are inviting Buddhists to step away from Buddhism and to join them, to join us in being vegans, in being ecological activists, in being otherwise engaged in this world. And again, with this tremendous sense of urgency, me, now. I'm worried about Bangkok being underwater. I'm worried about this last forest where there are a few elephants still alive, a few wild elephants, a few wild tigers. I'm worried about this stretch of river where there are a few wild dolphins. I need action. I need government resolutions. I need activism. I need this worldly, this generation concern. And yeah, there's also egoism. There's also self-centered activity involved and so on. And I also need you to take seriously the suffering of particular animals, that the death of this one cow matters. That it's not just that we shrug our shoulders and say, well, all of existence is a cycle of suffering and the only solution is nirvana, blah, blah, blah. No. I want you to look into this cow's eyes. I want you to deal with the reality that to produce meat that is not necessary and not healthy, you are causing this animal to live its whole life in a concrete shed and then die a miserable, meaningless death. No. This cow, this life, today, now, face it, feel it, and then let's get organized and let's get involved in political activism. That whole direction, even though I think Buddhism may prepare people for it, the reality is that is a direction that leads away from Buddhism. It's an exit from Buddhism. And I think it contradicts the fundamental impulses, aesthetics, and mythology of Buddhism. Because definitely the cycle of reincarnation, inclusive of heaven and hell and gods and angels and demons, that is the central mythology of Buddhism, no matter how much white Western Buddhists might want to choose to ignore it in trying to address their interest to a sanitized, westernized, modernized, secularized, and dishonest misrepresentation of what Buddhism is and why Buddhism has had such tremendous tenacity over the last 2,500 years. Hit me up.